Canada has had a long and difficult relationship with the Indigenous peoples. Since colonisation, they have faced long-standing racism and abuse. Whether it be the residential schools where Indigenous children were placed by force, and often beaten, abused and murdered in an attempt to erase their culture. Or the 60s scoop, where more than 20,000 Indigenous children were disproportionately stolen from their parents and put up for adoption in white families. Canada's Indigenous have been the victim of racist policies and procedures that have severely disturbed their traditional lives. Intergenerational trauma has created a culture that is lost and confused. And for Indigenous women, the statistics are particularly terrifying. These women often leave their small communities seeking work, only to find themselves caught up in prostitution, addiction, and/or human trafficking rings. As a result, they are 7 times more likely to be murdered than non-Indigenous women in Canada. Even worse, when police are called for missing Indigenous people, they're less likely to take the cases seriously. Activists have claimed they're probably just out partying. Has been a comment many Indigenous families have heard when reporting loved ones missing to police. Because of this stigma and racism, Indigenous women have become easy prey for murderers and sexual predators. For example, in 2004, when Canadian serial killer Robert Pickton was charged with 15 counts of murder, nearly half of the 22 bodies found on his property were thought to be those of Indigenous women. But activists believe he murdered many more. Institutionalized racism and violence is the setting of Tina Fontaine's story. While the plight of missing and murdered Indigenous women had already begun gaining traction in Canada, the murder of Tina Fontaine kick-started the movement into the phenomenon it is today. 15-year-old Tina Fontaine from Saking First Nation, Canada, didn't have an easy life. She was placed in the care of her great-aunt Thelma, where she was only 4 years old. Her mother struggled with addiction, and her father had been diagnosed with cancer. Her great-aunt Thelma described her as a happy and polite little girl. But in 2011, something happened that changed Tina's life. Her father, Eugene Fontaine, passed away, but not from the cancer he was battling. He had been beaten to death. His body was found behind a garden shed. In court, Nicholas Abraham and Jonathan Starr pleaded guilty to manslaughter, saying they'd been on a bender and gotten into a fight over money. Eugene Fontaine was stomped on the head and put in the shed, where he later died of a head injury. Sadly, Tina wouldn't live long enough to see the men convicted of their crime. After her father's death, the teen struggled to cope. She wanted to reconnect with her biological mother in Winnipeg, and with the permission of her great-aunt, she travelled there alone in June of 2014. It would be the last time her family saw her alive. When Tina arrived in Winnipeg, her mother wasn't able to take care of her. Worrying after not hearing from her niece, Thelma contacted Family and Child Services to find her. When Tina was located, they placed her in hotels and group homes, but the young girl kept running away. She had just experienced the death of her father and was suddenly in a new, exciting place. Tina started dating a 21-year-old man named Cody Mason, whom she met on the street. During her time there, she also began dabbling with drugs. In the 3 weeks before Tina was last seen alive, she was reported missing 4 times. Yet, somehow, her aunt wasn't notified of any of them. During these instances, Tina met social workers, paramedics, police officers, and hotel staff, yet none of them helped her get the therapy or deal with her issues. In fact, many of the systems meant to protect flat out failed the young girl. During one occasion, 2 officers reported seeing Tina while she was flagged as missing, but neither of them brought her back. As a testament to their misconduct, after her body was found, both officers were suspended and later resigned from the force. 8 hours after Tina's encounter with the officers, she was found unresponsive and sleeping in the street. A security guard brought her to a hospital where her urine tested positive for several kinds of drugs. These included marijuana, alcohol, gabapentin, cocaine, and methamphetamine. Hospital staff placed her back into the care of social services. Yet, not even 24 hours later, Tina was missing again. After Tina's body was found, her great-aunt said, "I just can't describe it. How I am still feeling, knowing that if they did their jobs, my baby might still be here." The last time Tina was reported missing was on August the 9th, 2014. People who knew her said she'd been partying and hanging with an older man named Sebastian. But Sebastian was really a 55-year-old man who went by his real name of Raymond Cormier, a man with an extensive criminal past. Tina's boyfriend told police he and Tina had met Cormier in mid-July. The older man took them to a house party and gave them drugs. The boyfriend had left to go back to his hometown shortly after and couldn't give police any more information. But other witnesses reported seeing Cormier with Tina in the days leading up to her death. 8 days after Tina was reported missing for the last time, her body was found in Winnipeg's Red River. It was wrapped in plastic and a tan-coloured duvet and had been weighed down with rocks. Sadly, degradation made it impossible to obtain any DNA from the body or the blanket. Experts later testified. But at least 3 witnesses came forward to tell police they had seen Cormier with the same blanket. Police also discovered that Cormier and Tina had gotten into an argument prior to her death because he had been making sexual advances towards the young girl. At one point, she was livid because the man had sold her bicycle for 2 grams of marijuana. To get revenge, she had threatened to call the cops and report him for a stolen truck parked at his home. Ernest de Wolf, a former friend of Cormier, later told the courts he had told him he had slept with Tina. "I sort of thought, really, she's a child," de Wolf recalled. When de Wolf later asked about the altercation regarding the truck, Cormier simply told him he had straightened it all out. Although witnesses came forward with information, it took police a year to arrest him. They used a Mr. Big sting technique to try and gather evidence. During a Mr. Big sting, officers posed as criminals to get a confession from the killer. They may create a fake criminal gang to get the suspect to brag about his former deeds. And oftentimes, they'll bug the suspect's home with surveillance cameras and recording devices. In the police's obtained recordings, Cormier seemed obsessed with Tina's death. At one point, he even admits he killed her. He says it's because they had sex and he later found out she was 15. He didn't want to be known as a skinner or a pedophile. 15-year-old girl, sick, he told a woman on July the 17th, 2015. I drew the line, and that's why she got killed. During another occasion, he stated, "You ever been haunted by something? What happened there really is not right. It's right on the shore. So what do I do? Threw her in." Police charged Cormier with second-degree murder. But when it came time for court, the prosecution faced a problem. Any DNA evidence had been eroded from time spent in the river, and they didn't have any physical evidence or witnesses linking Cormier to the death. In fact, the coroner couldn't determine what the cause of death was at all. In a mic drop moment, Tony Kavanagh, Cormier's lawyer, told the court they couldn't even prove Tina had died from an unlawful act to begin with, and that Cormier should be acquitted on that alone. Kavanagh said the recordings should be interpreted as a man lamenting the fact that he didn't do enough to help Tina, not as an admission of guilt. Although the prosecutor had the seeming confessions and people linking Cormier to the duvet in which Tina's body was found, a jury ultimately voted him not guilty, a decision which sparked outrage among the Indigenous community. More than 1,000 people took to the streets to call for change in a system they say failed her. Tina's case became a catalyst for several Indigenous grassroots movements, like Drag the Red, a group of volunteers who dragged the Red River for missing and murdered people, and the Bear Clan Patrol, who searched for missing members of their communities, a job they fear police aren't taking seriously. James Farville, an organiser with the Bear Clan Patrol, said that Tina's ultimately demise, the disrespect that was shown to her personhood, was the last straw for himself, my family, and my community at large. In addition to these movements, CFS is also no longer allowed to house children wards in public hotels. The Canadian Human Rights Commissioner also requested a full inquiry into the number of MMIW in Canada. Indigenous families accuse officers of misconduct and racism, saying they failed to properly follow up on leads that point to foul play in Indigenous cases. After the verdict, Kevin Hart, the Assembly of First Nations Regional Chief of Manitoba, said the CFS system has definitely failed Tina Fontaine. The Winnipeg Police Services failed Tina Fontaine, and Canadian society failed Tina Fontaine. Everybody right now across this country should be ashamed of themselves for the injustice that occurred here. Although Tina's life was tragically cut short, her story ultimately helped to shed light on the plight of Indigenous women and the violence and tragedies they face.